Inez Davenport was an ordinary woman, with no history of problems with the law, until her life changed drastically. Accused of a horrific crime, kidnapping and murdering Judge Renato Walker's 5-year-old daughter Clara, she was quickly tried and sentenced to life in prison. The media and the public had already condemned her long before the verdict, fueled by a media spectacle that painted Inez as a monster. However, when all seemed lost, Inez spoke some words in court that would change the course of her life forever. The truth, hidden beneath layers of lies and manipulations, finally began to emerge, revealing a dark plot that no one could have predicted. But how could these words have such power? And what really happened in that courtroom that made justice finally prevail? Inez Davenport, an ordinary woman with a peaceful life, never imagined that her name would be in the newspaper headlines as the main suspect in a heinous crime. Known for her kindness and integrity, Inez was always respected by everyone in the small town where she lived. However, her life was turned upside down when she was accused of kidnapping and murdering Clara, the 5-year-old daughter of Judge Renato Walker, an influential and feared figure in the community. The accusation came as a shock, not just for Inez, but for everyone who knew her. How could a woman like her commit such a cruel crime? Inez's arrest was quick and brutal. Without warning, police officers burst into her home, handcuffing her in front of her astonished neighbors. She was taken to the police station, where she was interrogated for hours, initially without the right to a lawyer. Throughout, Inez maintained her innocence, stating that she had never even seen Clara. But the evidence, seemingly irrefutable, said otherwise. A pair of children's shoes found in her home, combined with doctored phone records, pointed directly to her. The media, always eager for scandals, wasted no time in painting Inez as a monster, fueling the public outcry for justice. Inez's case was particularly complicated by the figure of Renato Walker, the victim's father. Renato, known for his rigidity and inflexibility as a judge, was an almost untouchable figure. His pain and anger were palpable, and he went to great lengths to ensure that Inez was convicted. Renato's influence in the local judicial system was enormous, and many believed that he was using all his power to ensure Inez's conviction, regardless of the truth. For many, it was clear that there was a conflict of interests, but few dared to question the judge, fearing reprisals. While in prison, Inez began to realize that there was something very wrong with her case. The evidence seemed to come out of nowhere, and every time she tried to defend herself, new obstacles were placed in her path. The police, pressured by Renato's influence and public opinion, seemed more interested in closing the case quickly than in seeking the truth. Inez began to fear that unless something drastically changed, she would spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she didn't commit. But despite her despair, she clung to the hope that the truth would somehow come out. What Inez didn't know was that, outside the prison walls, a determined lawyer was beginning to investigate the case with a critical eye. Giovanna Martinez, known for her skill in difficult cases and her unwavering belief in justice, was about to become Inez's greatest ally. Giovanna, upon realizing the glaring flaws in the process, decided that she would not rest until she proved Inez's innocence. And so, even when all seemed lost, a new light began to shine on the horizon for Inez, promising that the truth, however hidden, would eventually be revealed. Inez Davenport's trial quickly turned into a media spectacle, attracting attention not only in the small town, but across the country. From the moment the case was announced, cameras from the main broadcasters turned to the court, eager to capture every detail, every expression and every word spoken in court. The sensationalist narrative that the press created around Inez painted her as a cold and calculating woman, capable of committing the most abominable act, kidnapping and murdering an innocent child. The public, already influenced by the headlines, formed a negative opinion of her before the trial even began. The sensationalist coverage of the case not only distorted the facts, but also put immense pressure on everyone involved. For the jurors, who had the task of deciding Inez's fate, it was impossible to escape the influence of the media. Every day, they saw their faces in the newspapers and on television screens, accompanied by opinionated comments that, for the most part, already condemned her. The court, which was supposed to be a place of impartial justice, seemed more like an arena where Inés was judged not only by the evidence, but also by the court of public opinion. Renato Walker, the victim's father and judge presiding over the case, was also a central figure in this media circus. His pain, genuine and palpable, was explored exhaustively by the press. Every time he made a public appearance, the despair on his face was captured and reproduced millions of times, reinforcing the idea that Inés was guilty. Renato, known for his inflexibility, seemed determined to use his position to ensure that justice was served. However, many observers began to question whether he was truly seeking justice or whether he was being consumed by his thirst for revenge, letting his personal feelings cloud his judgment. Giovanna Martinez, Inés' defense lawyer, faced an uphill battle. From the beginning, she realized that she was not only defending Inés from the formal accusations, but also fighting against a public narrative that had already condemned her. Giovanna had to deal with a hostile press, which often distorted her words and actions, as well as a court where the cards seemed to be stacked against her. Still, she stood her ground, determined to prove her client's innocence, even if it meant facing the power and influence of Renato Walker. During the trial, the hearings were packed, with reporters and onlookers filling the courtroom every day. Witnesses were called one by one, and each statement seemed to increase the pressure on Inés even more. Giovanna knew that the real challenge would be to keep the jury focused on the evidence, and not on emotions or the sensationalist narrative that the media was creating. However, with each day that passed, it became increasingly clear that the line between justice and spectacle was dangerously blurred. And so, Inés' trial, which was supposed to be a fair and impartial process, became one of the most discussed and polarized cases in the country, with consequences that would extend far beyond the courtroom walls. From the beginning, Inés Davenport's trial was shrouded in controversy, but nothing was more disturbing than the obvious conflict of interests that permeated the case. Renato Walker, in addition to being the father of the alleged victim, Clara, was also the judge presiding over Inés' trial. This dual role raised numerous concerns about the impartiality of the process, as, for many, it was impossible to believe that Renato could separate his personal pain from his professional responsibilities. Renato's presence in the judge's chair seemed to transform the trial into a personal matter, where the search for justice was overtaken by a desire for revenge. Giovanna Martinez, the defense lawyer, quickly realized that Renato's direct involvement in the case was seriously compromising the integrity of the trial. From the beginning, Giovanna tried to argue that Renato should step down from presiding over the case, but her requests were ignored, both by Renato himself and by the local judicial system, which was reluctant to challenge such a powerful figure. This obstacle made Giovanna feel as if she was fighting on two fronts, one against the accusations against Inés, and the other against the structure of the trial itself, which seemed manipulated to guarantee a guilty verdict. With each day in court, Renato's actions reinforced the perception that he was far from being an impartial judge. His interventions during the trial were frequent and often emotionally charged, something Giovanna and many other observers considered inappropriate for someone in his position. Renato frequently cut off Giovanna's attempts to question the evidence presented by the prosecution, limiting her ability to adequately defend Inés. Furthermore, he showed evident deference to prosecution witnesses while treating defense witnesses with skepticism and hostility. For Inés, being judged by a man who clearly saw her as responsible for the pain he was feeling was devastating. She knew that regardless of the evidence, her chances of getting a fair trial were diminishing by the day. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, with everyone aware that Renato was using his position to influence the outcome of the case. The public, fed by the media narrative and Renato's stance, had already decided Inés' fate, which made Giovanna's task even more difficult. However, Giovanna was not willing to give up. She continued to press, trying to expose the conflict of interest that was undermining the trial. She knew that if she could convince the jury and the public that Renato could not be an impartial judge, she could change the course of the case. But this was a Herculean task, given the control Renato exercised over the court. Giovanna, however, was determined to fight until the end, aware that Inés' life depended on her ability to break through the barriers imposed by a system that seemed more interested in protecting its own interests than in seeking the truth. Giovanna Martinez knew that Inés Davenport's case would be the biggest challenge of her career. From the moment she accepted Inés' defense, she understood that she would be facing not only an apparently compromised judicial system, but also inflamed public opinion and a media that had already condemned her client. However, Giovanna believed in Inés' innocence and was determined to do everything in her power to ensure that the truth came to light. She knew that to do this she would need more than just legal skill. She would need courage, strategy, and an ability to stand firm in the face of relentless odds. Since the start of the trial, Giovanna has faced a series of obstacles. Renato Walker, who was presiding over the case, seemed willing to use his position to ensure that Inés was convicted. The evidence presented by the prosecution, although circumstantial, was presented as irrefutable, and the media was keen to reinforce this narrative. But Giovanna was not intimidated. She began her defense by questioning every piece of evidence, pointing out inconsistencies and suggesting that the elements presented by the prosecution could have been manipulated. To many, this seemed an impossible task. After all, who would dare challenge the word of such an influential judge? But Giovanna was not alone in her struggle. She assembled a dedicated team of private investigators, forensic experts, and other lawyers who shared her belief in Inés' innocence. Together, they began to dig deeper, looking for any clue that could prove that Inés was being framed. Giovanna spent sleepless nights, reviewing documents, analyzing testimonies, and preparing counter-arguments. She knew that every detail mattered and that the key to Inés' defense was in dismantling the narrative constructed by the prosecution. In court, Giovanna was implacable. She not only questioned the evidence presented, but also confronted the prosecution's witnesses, challenging their statements and exposing possible hidden motivations. One of the highlights of her defense was when she brought to light Renato Walker's obvious conflict of interest, highlighting how his actions and decisions during the trial had compromised the impartiality of the process. Although many were still reluctant to admit Renato's bias, Giovanna's performance began to plant doubts in both the jury and the public. Throughout the trial, Giovanna also made a point of humanizing Inés in the eyes of the jury and the public. She presented witnesses who spoke of Inés' upright character, her simple life, and her inability to commit such an atrocious crime. Giovanna painted a portrait of Inés as a victim of a corrupted system, an ordinary woman who was made a scapegoat for circumstances beyond her control. This approach humanized Inés and began to change the jury's perception, which until then had been bombarded with a negative image of her. Giovanna knew that the battle was far from over, but with each small victory, she came closer to exposing the truth and freeing Inés from the clutches of failed justice. The most intense and controversial point in Inés Davenport's trial occurred during the witness testimonies. Each testimony seemed to carry the weight of a decision that had already been made outside the courtroom. The media and public were hungry for details, and emotions were running high. Key witnesses for both the prosecution and defense took the stand, and every word spoken had the power to shape Inés' destiny. Renato Walker, with his constant and relentless presence, kept a strict watch over each statement, and this only increased the tension. The prosecution's witnesses were the first to testify, and their accounts were devastating. People who claimed to have known Inés for a long time painted a dark picture of her, describing her as an unstable woman capable of acts of violence. One of the witnesses, a former co-worker, stated that Inés had demonstrated suspicious behavior shortly before Clara's disappearance. Although her words were emotionally charged, Giovanna quickly noticed inconsistencies in her reports. However, each statement seemed to further seal Inés' fate in the eyes of the jury and the public, who eagerly watched the events unfold. On the other hand, when the defense witnesses took the stand, the atmosphere changed. Giovanna had prepared a careful strategy to show the jury that Inés was a woman of good character, loved by her friends and respected by her neighbors. One of the most moving witnesses was a childhood friend of Inés, who described the kindness and generosity that had always been part of her personality. She recounted moments in their lives when Inés had shown compassion and empathy, characteristics that contrasted sharply with the monster image painted by the prosecution. This testimony was crucial in humanizing Ines in the eyes of the jury, bringing tears to the eyes of many present. But the emotional peak of the trial occurred when Giovanna called Ines' mother to testify. Visibly shaken, Ines' mother could barely contain her tears as she spoke about the daughter she raised, highlighting how much she always believed in her innocence. She implored the jury to look beyond the accusations and manipulations, and to consider the possibility that her daughter was being wrongly accused. This moment was devastating not only for Ines, who watched in silence, but also for many in the courtroom, who began to question whether they were being fair in their perception. The emotion that permeated the courtroom during these testimonies was almost palpable. Giovanna knew she was fighting a tide of prejudice and heightened emotions, but she also knew she needed to stay focused on evidence and logic. Each emotional testimony was a double-edged sword. While some helped the defense, others reinforced the desire for conviction. The jury, faced with so many conflicting stories and so much pain, was in a delicate position. Giovanna understood that, despite emotions, justice needed to prevail. And it was his responsibility to make sure that, in the midst of all the emotional turmoil, the truth finally emerged. Near the end of the trial, when everything seemed to be lost for Ines Davenport, an unexpected turn of events changed the course of events. During one of the last sessions, while Giovanna Martinez was making one last attempt to defend her client, Ines asked to speak directly to the court. The request surprised everyone, including her lawyer, who knew that any misplaced word could seal Ines' fate. However, there was something in Ines' expression, a silent determination, that made Giovanna agree to let her speak. The court, already charged with tension, was completely silent when Ines stood up. Ines began her statement in a firm but calm voice. She reaffirmed her innocence, something she had done countless times during the trial, but this time there was a new conviction in her words. Ines looked directly at Renato Walker, the judge presiding over the case, and revealed a truth that no one expected to hear. Clara, Renato's daughter, was not dead, but alive. According to Ines, Clara was being kept hidden by her own father, Renato, in a desperate effort to protect dark secrets that he didn't want to come to light. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and commotion, and Renato, visibly shaken, tried to interrupt Ines, but she continued. Ines explained that, during her time in prison, she had received information from an anonymous source, which was later confirmed by a former employee of Renato. This person revealed that Renato was involved in illegal activities and that, fearing that these activities would be exposed, he had faked the kidnapping and death of his own daughter to divert attention. Clara, according to Ines, had been taken to a safe location, where she was being kept away from the public eye, to ensure that no one discovered the truth. The revelation was shocking, and the court entered a state of chaos. Giovanna, although skeptical at first, realized that this could be the missing piece of the puzzle. Ines' revelation made everything start to make sense. Renato's behavior, the manipulation of evidence, and the almost desperate effort to guarantee Ines' conviction. Immediately, Giovanna asked the court for an investigation to be launched to verify Ines' allegations. Renato, still trying to maintain control, furiously denied the accusations, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, both in court and in public opinion. The deputy judge, who was now aware of Renato's conflict of interest, ordered the investigation to be conducted immediately. Police officers were sent to the location indicated by Ines, and the court was suspended until new information was brought to light. During those hours of waiting, the atmosphere in the court was pure tension. Everyone was anxiously awaiting the outcome of this surprising revelation. For Ines, that moment represented the last chance to prove her innocence. And while everyone waited, Ines' confidence didn't waver. She knew the truth was about to be discovered, and with it, her freedom. Following Ines' bombshell revelation, the court went into abeyance, and the investigation to verify the veracity of her allegations was immediately launched. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone in the courtroom, from jurors to spectators, anxiously awaited the development of events. Giovanna Martinez, aware of the gravity of the situation, knew that this investigation could be the turning point between Inés' freedom and the perpetuation of an injustice. While the police headed to the location indicated by Inés, Giovanna remained at her client's side, trying to remain calm and confident, despite the uncertainty that hovered over everyone. The investigators, accompanied by a forensic team and under the watchful eye of the assistant judge, arrived at the location described by Inés, the country house belonging to a close friend of Renato Walker, located in a remote and isolated area. Upon arrival, the police surrounded the property and entered cautiously, ready to find whatever was necessary to confirm or refute Inés' statements. Inside the house, in a locked room, they found what everyone feared. Clara, Renato's daughter, was alive and well, although visibly scared. The discovery was nothing short of shocking. The confirmation that Clara was alive instantly changed the course of the trial. The accusations against Inés began to fall apart like a house of cards. The truth was finally emerging. Renato Walker had orchestrated the kidnapping of his own daughter to cover up his illegal activities and, at the same time, manipulate the judicial system to ensure Inés' conviction. When the news reached the court, the impact was devastating. Giovanna, although pleased with the revelation, knew that there was still a lot of work to be done to expose the full extent of Renato's manipulations. Renato, faced with reality, desperately tried to maintain his position, denying involvement in any illegal activity and claiming that he had hidden Clara to protect her from unknown threats. However, with Clara now safe and under the protection of the police, her version of events quickly began to fall apart. Incriminating documents were found on the property, linked to Renato's shady dealings, and additional testimony from his accomplices began to surface, painting a clear picture of his guilt. Giovanna and Inés, who had gone through weeks of uncertainty and despair, finally saw the light at the end of the tunnel. The investigation not only exonerated Inés, but also exposed the deep corruption that permeated the local judicial system, with Renato Walker at the center of it all. The court, which had been the scene of one of the biggest scandals in recent history, was now about to become a symbol of restored justice. For Inés, that moment marked the beginning of the end of a nightmare that almost destroyed her life. But for Renato, this was the beginning of a fall that he could never have predicted. The revelation that Clara was alive and hidden by her own father, Renato Walker, was the beginning of a cascade of events that would result in the complete downfall of a once powerful and feared man. Renato, who had always been known for his strictness and influence in the judicial system, now found himself at the center of a scandal that quickly spread across the country. The evidence against him began to accumulate, and what had once seemed like an unshakable position began to crumble. The man who had manipulated the system to convict Inés was now about to face the consequences of his actions. Immediately after Clara's discovery, Renato was removed from his duties as a judge and placed under investigation. The media, which previously portrayed him as a desperate father in search of justice, turned against him, exposing details of his life that until then had been hidden. The reports revealed a web of corruption, abuse of power and manipulation that Renato had woven over the years. Public opinion, which had previously supported him, now called for his arrest and justice. Renato, a man used to controlling everything around him, found himself helpless, at the mercy of a system that he himself had corrupted. Giovanna Martinez, who had fought tirelessly to prove Inés' innocence, now focused her efforts on ensuring that Renato was held accountable for his crimes. With the help of investigators and the police, Giovanna worked to dismantle the network of influence that Renato had built. With each new discovery, it became clear that Renato had used his position to enrich himself and protect his own interests, often at the expense of justice. The courtroom, which had once been a battleground for Giovanna, now became a place where she could finally see justice being done. Renato, realizing that there was no way out, tried to use the last vestiges of his power to negotiate a sentence reduction. He offered information about his accomplices and other cases in which he had manipulated the system in exchange for leniency. However, the weight of the charges was overwhelming, and authorities knew that allowing Renato to escape severe punishment would be an insult to justice. Thus, Renato was formally accused of a series of crimes, including kidnapping, corruption, and abuse of power. His trial was swift and, unlike Inés' trial, It was conducted with the impartiality and seriousness that he himself had denied to others. Renato's fall was a landmark event, not just for the city, but for the entire country. The man who had considered himself untouchable now faced the reality of a long prison sentence, with all the privileges and power he once possessed being stripped away. For Ines, seeing Renato finally face justice was a moment of relief and vindication. She, who had been the victim of his cruelty and manipulation, could now breathe knowing that the truth had prevailed. However, for Renato, it was the beginning of a dark new reality. A reality where he was just one among many, without the power and influence that once defined him. With the truth finally exposed and Renato Walker unmasked, the court prepared for the final act in Ines Davenport's case, her complete exoneration. The revelation that Clara was alive, coupled with the evidence that Renato had manipulated the case from the beginning, made it clear that Ines had been the victim of a terrible injustice. For Ines, the moment of her release was bittersweet. Although she was relieved that her innocence had been proven, she could not forget the days of anguish and suffering she had endured in prison, nor the devastating impact this experience had on her life. The hearing that formalized Ines' dismissal was filled with emotion. Giovanna Martinez, who had fought tirelessly alongside Ines, was at her side in court, representing not only a lawyer, but also a friend and defender of justice. The assistant judge, who had taken over the case after Renato's fall, officially declared that all charges against Ines had been dropped and that she was now a free woman, with all her rights restored. The verdict was met with a wave of relief, and many of those present in court, who had previously believed in Ines' guilt, now applauded her release. Ines' exoneration was a milestone not only for her, but for the entire community that had followed the case closely. His story has become a symbol of the fight against corruption and the importance of a fair and impartial judicial system. Giovanna, in particular, was celebrated as a hero, recognized for her courage and dedication in defending a cause that many considered lost. However, both Ines and Giovanna knew that the battle did not end there. There were still many challenges ahead, including Ines' emotional and psychological recovery and the reconstruction of her life after the devastation that the case brought. After her dismissal, Ines was welcomed by a crowd of supporters outside the court. Family, friends, and even strangers who were moved by her story were there to show solidarity. Although grateful for the support, Ines knew her journey to recovery would be long. The time in prison, the false accusations, and the public trial left deep scars. However, with the help of Giovanna and her community, Ines began to take the first steps towards rebuilding her life. She decided that rather than letting herself be defined by the suffering she faced, she would use her experience to help others who, like her, were wrongly accused. Ines' release also marked the beginning of significant changes in the local judicial system. The scandal involving Renato Walker exposed the urgent need for reforms to prevent power from being abused so blatantly again. Giovanna, driven by the success in Ines' case, became actively involved in movements that pressed for these reforms. She and Ines have become important voices in the fight for justice, using Ines' story as an example of what can happen when the system fails. For both, the dismissal was not the end, but the beginning of a new mission, ensuring that what happened to Ines never happened to anyone else again. With the dismissal of Ines Davenport and the fall of Renato Walker, a new chapter began to be written in the history of the local judicial system. The injustice suffered by Ines catalyzed a movement for reform that aimed to ensure that no other individual would go through the same torment. Giovanna Martinez, now a prominent figure in the fight for justice, led efforts to implement sweeping changes. Her experience in Ines' case had taught her that the system, when manipulated by those in positions of power, could become a tool of oppression, and she was determined to correct this. The reforms began with a rigorous review of judicial processes, especially in cases where there were possible conflicts of interest. New guidelines were established to ensure that no judge could preside over a case in which they had personal involvement, as in the case of Renato and Ines. In addition, independent commissions were created to oversee investigations and ensure that all processes were conducted in a fair and impartial manner. Giovanna, with her influential voice, actively participated in these committees, using Inés' story as an example of what needed to be avoided at any cost. For Inés, the journey of redemption was both personal and public. Although he was free from the charges, the trauma he faced did not immediately disappear. Over time, she began to work on her recovery, counting on the support of therapists, friends, and, especially, Giovanna. Inés decided she wanted to use her story to help others who might be facing similar situations. She began speaking publicly about her experience, attending conferences and events where she shared her story of survival and overcoming. His courage in facing the public and recounting the darkest moments of his life inspired many and reinforced the need for constant vigilance over the justice system. In addition to her work as a speaker, Inés became involved in organizations that fought for the rights of unjustly accused prisoners. She became a tireless advocate, using her notoriety to press for fair investigations and compensation for those, like her, who had been victims of miscarriages of justice. Her determination to turn her pain into a force for good did not go unnoticed. Gradually, Inés began to feel more at peace with her past, knowing that she was contributing to a future where justice truly prevailed. Inés' family also began to rebuild after the storm. Clara, who had been used as a pawn in Renato's scheme, was reintegrated into his life, and together they began to form new bonds, free from the shadows that previously haunted them. Inés, with the support of Giovanna, fought to give Clara a normal and safe life, far from the traumas that had marked her early life. And so, over time, Inés' home, once a place of pain and uncertainty, began to flourish again as a symbol of hope and renewal. In the end, Inés Davenport's case left a lasting legacy. Not only did it expose the flaws in a system that desperately needed reform, it also demonstrated the power of human resilience. Inés and Giovanna, with their strength and determination, not only changed their own lives, but also impacted the justice system in a way that would be felt for many years to come. Together, they showed that even in the darkest circumstances, it is possible to find redemption and use that experience to make the world a more just and compassionate place. Inés Davenport's story teaches us that the truth, no matter how hidden it is, always finds a way to surface. The system can fail, people can be manipulated, but justice, in the end, is a powerful force when defended by those who do not give up. And you, have you ever stopped to think about how many times we accept a truth without question? How many lives could have been destroyed by a corrupt system or hasty judgments? If this story made you reflect on what justice really means, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Let's continue exploring stories that defy appearances and make us question what is truly fair. After all, knowing and fighting for the truth is something that we should all do.